Point 2, the self-defense instruction. In general, a defendant's entitled to a jury instruction when substantial evidence and the reasonable inferences drawn therefrom support the theory propounded in the requested instruction. In making this determination, a court must view the evidence in the light most favorable to the defendant. So this is different than what we've been talking about, right? We've been talking about how the Court of Appeals looks at the evidence on appeal after a finding of guilty. It looks at the evidence from the trial in the light most favorable to the prosecution, to the jury's finding of guilt. But at the trial itself, earlier, before the conviction, when considering a requested jury instruction from the defense, well, the defendant's not yet been found guilty. He's still presumed innocent. So at that point, the trial court looks at the evidence in the light most favorable to the defendant, appropriately so. You can see how that completely flips once you're convicted and on appeal. Again, appeals are for losers. Continuing now with the decision, the trial court's rejection of a proffered instruction should be affirmed if the trial court was correct for any reason. At trial, Poole proffered a self-defense instruction that omitted initial aggressor language, which the state had requested. The trial court rejected Poole's instruction in favor of giving instruction number 11, which included language that an initial aggressor is not justified in using physical force to defend himself from the counterattack he provoked. Poole argues the record lacks evidence that he was the initial aggressor, and therefore the trial court erred in refusing his proffered self-defense instruction without the initial aggressor language. Although Poole's point on appeal directly challenges the trial court's refusal to give his instruction, Poole indirectly challenges the trial court's giving instruction number 11, which included the initial aggressor language, which he argues prejudiced him by precluding the jury from finding that he justifiably shot Long in self-defense if it was determined that he was the initial aggressor. Well, of course it does do that, but that's the very purpose of the instruction. If you are the initial physical aggressor, you're not supposed to be privileged to justify yourself in self-defense. Now, I don't know if the court is going to get into this. I can't remember if this was in the opinion, but there are circumstances in which you might be the initial aggressor and still have a privilege of self-defense. So you were the initial aggressor, you've lost the element of innocence, you've lost self-defense, but there are ways to regain innocence, neither of which seems to apply here, but I'll describe them for purposes of discussion. So one way to regain innocence is by withdrawal in communication. So you were the initial aggressor, but then you realize you're acting crazy, you withdraw from the fight, and you communicate your withdrawal from the fight. Hey, sorry, I don't want to fight anymore. Now for the fight to continue, because you're withdrawing and you've communicated your withdrawal to the other party, they know you don't want to fight and you're physically withdrawing from the fight. For the fight to continue now, the other party has to come to you. And in the eyes of the law, if that happens, they've started a second fight in which they are the initial aggressor and you've regained innocence. You've regained innocence for purposes of the second fight. You're still on the hook for the first fight. Right. So if you threw a punch, it's a simple battery. You're still on the hook for that. You haven't regained innocence retroactively, but you've regained innocence moving forward from the point of withdrawal and communication. Or if what you started was merely an if what you started was a non-deadly fight, you provoked a non-deadly confrontation, you shoved somebody, and they respond unlawfully with deadly defensive force. Well, if they do that, they violated the requirement of proportionality in self-defense. In effect, what they've done is, again, they've started a second fight. You started the first fight. You started the initial non-deadly force fight. You're the initial aggressor for that. You can't claim self-defense for that because you lost innocence by being the initial aggressor. But by them unlawfully escalating a non-deadly force fight to a deadly force fight, they responded to your shove with a knife or a gun. They've started a second fight, a deadly force fight in which they are the deadly force initial aggressor, and you have innocence in the context of that second fight. They're the unlawful deadly force aggressor in that second fight. That wouldn't, neither of these would happen here, right? There's no evidence that Poole ever withdrew and communicated prior to his use of deadly force on the victim. And he initiated with deadly force. An assault rifle. So there's no escalation from deadly force. If you're initiating with deadly force, that's as high as it gets. All right. So the focus, continuing now with the decision, the focus of this point on appeal is whether the record contained sufficient evidence from which a jury reasonably could find that Poole, the appellant, was the initial aggressor in the altercation with the victim, Long. Evidence of aggression need not be irrefutable to support the submission of the initial aggressor language in a self-defense instruction. Missouri courts have held that the state need not present undisputed evidence that the defendant was an initial aggressor in order to submit the issue to the jury. Conflicting evidence as to who was the initial aggressor presents an issue of fact for the jury to decide. Again, once there's more than 0% evidence on a question, well, then it's up to the finder of fact to evaluate that evidence. The Missouri approved instructions, criminal, so this is Missouri standardized criminal jury instructions, notes on use provide that the initial aggressor language should be used unless there is no evidence that the defendant was the initial aggressor. An initial aggressor is one who attacks or threatens to attack, or one who provokes the incident. Poole contends he was prejudiced because self-defense is not available if the defendant was the initial aggressor unless he withdrew from the conflict. So that's the withdrawal and communication I just described. Here, Poole suggests the record contains no evidence that he was the initial aggressor. Well, that's patently untrue, of course. Instead, Poole posits the evidence proves that Long was the initial aggressor because Long asked Poole if he wanted to fight and later retrieved a shotgun, which he racked in a sign of aggression. So this is the defense building a narrative of innocence from the building blocks of evidence, right? Then it's up to the jury to decide whether or not they buy it. Undermining Poole's claim that there is no evidence indicating that Poole was the initial aggressor in his altercation with the victim, Long, the state elicited testimony that Poole arrived at Rob's home with 3 armed men and threatened to kill Long before shooting at him in 2 separate instances. Evidence was adduced that Long retreated into the house to retrieve a shotgun only after Poole displayed a firearm and threatened to kill Long. Importantly, the record lacks evidence that Long fired any shots, whereas Poole shot at Long in 2 separate instances during the incident. We, the Court of Appeals, are persuaded from these facts that a jury reasonably could find that Poole was the initial aggressor. At most, Poole identifies conflicting evidence as to whether Poole or Long was the initial aggressor in this case. Conflicting evidence as to who was the initial aggressor presented an issue of fact for the jury to decide, and was properly included in the self-defense jury instruction. Therefore, the trial court did not err in rejecting Poole's requested instruction that omitted initial aggressor language. Point 2 also denied. And then we have point 3. Point 3 are these motions for acquittal that were made by the defense at the close of the state's case and the close of the trial proper, when the defense rested as well. These were all denied by the trial court, and I'm not going to read through all this. We've already discussed this kind of pro forma technical motion. Let's just say the point 3 on these motions to acquit were also denied by the Court of Appeals, and the judgment of the trial court is affirmed. The guilty verdict is affirmed.